afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. As I was getting ready for this, I got some advice, I saw some advice online which said never to give the new speaker the first talk on the final day. And I'm the new speaker giving the first talk on the final day. So I'll do my best to not speak too fast or hopefully keep you engaged. I only have a couple of slides here because I want to jump into demoing our application, which of course is written in Cake. Real briefly, I work for a nonprofit based here in San Francisco called Invenio. Invenio works in a space that is commonly known as ICT or ICT for D. What that means is we build technology infrastructure in developing countries. We work primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, places like that. The Caribbean, we have a lot of work in Haiti, and we're starting to move into the South Pacific, places like Micronesia and Indonesia, where there are islands that don't have connectivity to the internet or don't have good connectivity. And so what we're doing is we're building long-range Wi-Fi networks and bringing broadband to places where the telcos and the other mobile network operators are not interested in going. My username on most systems is, as it's shown on the slide here. I don't actually use Twitter as I find it limiting and restrictive, but you can find me on most systems with the username Clark Ritchie. So I thought I would start with a huge disclaimer, which is that this project has taken so many twists and turns since its inception, and that's a story I'm sure everyone here has lived and lives in their projects. What started out as a 6 to 7 week contract for me has now turned into a year plus of development, and what we thought was going to be a little schools database to manage a project in Tanzania is now this full-fledged application to do a whole bunch of other things that was never in scope. And I think thanks to the flexibility of Cake, we've been able to adapt to those changes, and hopefully you'll see in a few minutes that it's turned into something that's pretty unique. I thought I'd start with just a little primer on when I say long-range Wi-Fi, what that means. When I told my dad I'm building Wi-Fi networks, he thought I was going around plugging in Netgear access points, and that was the end of that. I was like, no, Dad, it's much different than that. We put equipment up on towers, usually co-located on cell towers. We either rent space or we're donated space. So we're talking big radio dishes that are basically a meter in diameter. We run them up somewhere between 25 and 40 meters up high on a tower. So we have a lot of working at height. Pulling the dishes up to the top of the tower, securing them, running the Ethernet cabling, crimping, and all the other physical requirements that go along with that. We run a radio link, we have radio on one end and a radio on the other that are pointed at each other. Those links tend to be somewhere in the range of 20 to 60 kilometers typically. We currently run a 90-kilometer link off the coast of Kenya out to a little island in Lake Victoria. And we think that's the longest Wi-Fi link, certainly in all of Africa, to deliver a 0.5 megabit of connectivity to a little tiny island where some folks live. We use pretty much exclusively Ubiquiti radios, and I brought one here just to show you what it looks like. It's really small, it's really simple, it's cheap, it's like $80, $90. They install behind a big dish. The dish is much more expensive, about $300. These ones run in the 5 gigahertz unlicensed spectrum. And you can get pretty good connectivity. You can get 30 to 60 megabits, over 30, 40 kilometers, which is not bad, depending on the terrain that you're going over. If you're going over a mixture of land and water, different things happen because radio waves bounce in different directions. But at these sites where we have towers or where we're installing our equipment, whole bunch of different power sources, typically negative 48 volt direct current from a big diesel generator that churns away all day and spews out exhaust and stinks and is hot, and I don't want to get anywhere near that. Sometimes we have AC power, 120 or 240 volts. We have a couple solar installations, which are pretty cool. A bunch of solar panels feeding a battery bank that keep our equipment running. But these radios all run on power over Ethernet, PoE. So we have a power source at the bottom that feeds an enclosure that we maintain that then runs up to the top of the tower, powers the radios. We use 12 volt microtik routers and 24 volt switches. We have a lot of environmental challenges. It's really, really hot in a lot of these places, and when you put equipment into a small enclosure and it's already 45 degrees Celsius outside, that box can heat up to 55 or 60 pretty quickly. Hurricanes, we have a lot of hurricanes in the Caribbean in particular. It's humidity, we have lightning. A lot of our locations are extremely rural, and to deploy a team to go maintain a piece of equipment that is 8 hours outside of a town that requires a 4x4 and all sorts of stuff to access. It's really important for us to have a good grip on our network, to know what's configured where, and so that if we do have to dispatch a team, they know what they're getting into before they get out there. And that's what I'm going to get into here in just a moment. That's the application that I've developed, written in Cake, that helps us do that. We had a killer bee problem in Haiti, and this is an official Invenio issued bee suit. This guy has a really good spirit. His name's Cadet Nixon. I'm sure he's sweltering inside of that because it's probably about 110 Fahrenheit with 100% humidity. This is a black mamba, Africa's longest and most venomous snake, and one of them recently crawled into one of our solar enclosures and managed to get itself wrapped around the positive and negative terminals, and he didn't live, and neither did our equipment, which all shorted out and went down. But I just thought I'd throw this slide up there. So especially for the core developers, if you're ever wondering, what in the heck are people doing with Cake, and it's keeping us away from these guys because they are 4 meters long and they cruise at 20 kilometers an hour, which is faster than I can run, or maybe that's my top speed, but I pretty much never want to run into one of those guys. Earlier this year, we had a lightning strike in Haiti, and I'm surprised. I actually expected more charring in this. This is called a lightning arrestor, and it's something that we install between our equipment and the tower so that a lightning strike, the power is diverted into the ground line. But it did its job. It failed as designed, and our equipment did not need to be replaced. So I'm going to talk about Tower Database, which is my mission statement here is it's an application for managing the design and deployment of wireless broadband networks. It really has 3 functions, and this grew out of a need at Invenio of managing the design of our networks through a combination of documents and spreadsheets and the typical hodgepodge of things that you would do to project manage a design and construction of a large network. It provides us a network overview. So show me what's going on in this network. Show me where do I have equipment installed. Give me a network inventory. I want to be the definitive source for a project so that if I'm talking with an engineer and we're saying, look, this router is not configured properly or whatever that we have a common place to go for that. And then also aid in the design and deployment of large wireless networks. Small networks, 6, 7, 8 towers might have 10, 12 radios, a couple routers, a couple switches. It's not that hard to keep in your head. But if you've got 500 towers and a bunch of different places, it gets really complicated to sort of keep in mind how you designed everything. So this application sort of fits a little sweet spot in between other tools that we use, like Google Earth, Radio Mobile, tool for RF link planning and other applications. Tower Database is now sort of the hub of all of our planning activities. I did recently open source this, and it terrifies me that someone might actually go out and use it. They might see all of my hideous code and debug statements and things that I've left in. But this is all funded through a generous grant we got from Google. So I thank Google for paying my salary for the last year. I've been telling my boss, I'm like, look, my application's getting hard to keep in my head. It's about 25,000 lines of code now. This is my object model. It made sense to me at one point. It still mostly does. I think I've done things pretty well. Let's see here. Let's jump into it if I can find it. I'm going to be working here on my local host because the connectivity is a little sluggish. You might notice if anybody here is a front-end developer. I'm sorry. I'm not a front-end developer. Is anybody into front-end stuff? All right, we've got 2 or 3 half-raised hands. So for those of you who are front-end developers, you might have recognized this is Bootstrap, a nice library for doing CSS and other things. And I'm probably pushing the limits here at 1024 by 768, how this is going to fit on this screen here. But Bootstrap has, like I said, I don't care for front-end development at all. I try to avoid it. But we went ahead and put it in this project. It's worked out pretty well with Cake. And one of the things that I think is pretty slick, for example here, is something called Bootbox. Bootbox provides nice Twitter Bootstrap-like dialog boxes that integrate well with the overall front-end stuff. Kind of gives a little bit nicer user experience. And that's through a mixture of jQuery and overriding the HTML helper so that every time I want to do a post link of some sort, those dialog boxes are automatically created for me. So this is my application here. So we're starting in a project here in Haiti, and I really like this map. And maybe I like it because I hated all the other maps that are out there. Cake has a couple Google Map integration plugins. Some of them are basically defunct. I was using one for a while, but it didn't have polyline support, so I had to drop it and kind of go with a more native solution here, which is the Google jQuery UI library for drawing maps. And the reason I really like this map is because I can toggle it. Here I've got, everywhere I have an icon here, I have some piece of equipment. These are what we call sites in the application. And a site has probably multiple radios, a router and a switch, that kind of stuff. So everywhere I have an icon, I have a site, but sites can be different states, right? They could be planned, they could be active, they could be deactivated. So my application here has multiple project support, meaning I can switch between Haiti and some other network that we manage. And those listing of sites change correspondingly with the project because different projects might have different terminologies. But I really like that I can toggle these things on and off. And that is an integration that worked out quite nicely. Maps even resize to fit nicely. And as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the reasons I switched libraries is just to add polyline supports that I could actually see what's connected to what in my application. So right here, I mean, if I stop here and said that's the end of my project, this right here is a view of our network that we either were doing previously in a drawing tool, Visio, OmniGraffle, whatever. But now this is at least connected to what's behind all of these places. So everywhere I have a blue link here, I have a wireless connection. And you can see here, everything for this network happens to start just outside Port-au-Prince, where we've got a tower that feeds a bunch of other stuff. So I can click into any of these sites here and see information about the site. I have the coordinates. When I create a site, the coordinates that's one of my required fields, and I go out and I fetch the declination from the National Weather Service. So as long as I create 2 sites here, now I can do interesting things, like I can put a radio at this site and put a radio at that site and point them at each other. So we've got all sorts of other metadata, like who's the guard. I need to call Luke Shode. I can't even, I'm not even going to try it. But here we've got information about this tower, stuff I said that was previously buried in a bunch of different spreadsheets. And now everyone can be on the same page. Who are the contacts that we're going to call if something goes down? Priority 1 contact is to call the Digicel NOC, that type of stuff. And then here are the switches and routers and radios located at this site. What switch port are they plugged into? What frequency are they running at? What is their SSID? I'm going to jump to one of my test projects here because I actually don't want to mess up the data in this project. But so one of the early design decisions that I struggled with, and I'm happy to be corrected here, is that we've got all these great relations, belongs to, has many, that type of stuff, and that's for one thing that's related to another thing. I couldn't figure out how to make 2 things relate to each other that were the same thing. I've got a radio, and I've got a radio. This radio has one radio, and this radio has one radio. But Cake didn't seem to like that. And I don't know if it's possible for things to have relations to their own type. I'm getting some nods in the back. I can't find it in the book, or if it's in the book, it's confusing. So I came up with my own solution, which hopefully is not too bad. So when I create a radio here, I can call this radio A or radio A. It doesn't really matter what site I put it at. I'll put it at my office. And I can pick things like the frequency, how high is it. I'm going to give it the SSID of CakeFest and hit save. And now I'll create another radio, radio B. And its SSID is CakeFest. And, oops, I put that on the wrong site. Let me put that in my house. Okay, so now I have, if I go back to my radio here, I'm looking at radio A. It's located at Clark's house. It is linked to radio B. All right, so Clark's house has a GPS coordinate and a declination. And my office, where the other radio is attached, has a GPS coordinates and declination. So Cake figures out that they're 2.05 kilometers apart. If I were to go out and get a compass and stand in front of my house, I can turn the compass to 81.53 degrees, and that's where I need to point my radio. So right there, I can now have like a huge capability that was really, really difficult with Excel previously. It's just figuring out what are the angles between these two things, because eventually I got to send teams out and say, you know what, you guys need to climb 40 meters up on this tower. You need to drive 6 hours out into the desert, climb 40 meters on a tower, and point something at something else that's 40 kilometers away. And that's sometimes hard. So Cake's been a big asset to us for helping us figure out just those little tiny things here that make our work a lot easier. Now, the way I ended up doing this, since I said I couldn't figure out how to do it in Cake itself, is that I went to, if I can find it, which I appear to have lost it. Where is there we go. I wrote it in SQL. Hopefully that's not too much of a hack, but I wrote a trigger. So every time I add a radio, update a radio, or delete a radio, it goes out, it finds the matching radios, and then in a hopefully Cake-ish way, creates a join table, which has a source radio and a destination radio and notes just for my own personal debugging purposes. So where this gets a little more complicated is that we have point-to-point radios, 2 things are pointed at each other, and point-to-multi-point radios, which is I've got a radio here and I've got 2 radios 40 kilometers away. I think I can get both of those guys if I aim kind of right in the middle of them, because my radio waves are going to expand as they cruise along their path. Radios are not lasers. I can't say go right there. I get a spread. And that's something here that I can support in my application. For example, I can say, okay, radio A is actually a multi-point radio. And let me go back to network radios. I'll make a new radio, radio C. And its SSID is also CakeFest. And now if I go back and look at radio A is connected to radio B and radio C, but radio B is, of course, only connected back to radio A. So my join table then contains all of those right relations. So I beg for your forgiveness. At the minimum, I named my tables consistently, and I thought it was a pretty clever solution. So one of the things that I don't have a lot of time here to go through my application here, and one of the things that I thought I would show as I switch over to the live site, you switch to a project. As I get out of focus and switch to one of our projects here that we're working on right now. Internet Now. So one of the things that's difficult in network design and network planning is IP address management. You know, again, if you have a small network, your home network, you might have 10 things on it. It's not that hard to sort of keep everything in mind. But if I've got 500 radios and complicated routing schemes so that if I lose a tower in the middle of my core loop, everything can route the other way and get back out to the internet, I need to think about my IP address provisioning a little bit more carefully. And there's not a lot of tools out there that do this. There are some. There's one called 6Connect, and it's beyond awesome and amazing. It costs a fortune and takes a rocket science degree to use. And so I was like, well, I kind of don't want to do all of those things. I want to do some of those things. And so I've implemented here something called IP spaces, and this uses Cake's tree behavior, which if any of the developers here worked on tree behavior, like that's awesome. I love it. That made my life so much easier. And I copied another behavior that I found and used elsewhere called cryptable, the cryptable behavior, to create my own behavior called IPv4. If I can find my IDE. Where is my IDE? Okay, here we go. Now I have a spinning pinwheel. So we wait for Mac to catch up. So one of the things with IP addresses and the system that I was hoping to replace and make better was storing IP addresses in the database as strings. And I was like, well, that's probably not the right way to do it, because every time I read it, I got to chunk it up at 10.5. Whatever. That seems cumbersome to me. And likewise, every time I write it, I got to do something else with it. When in fact, both PHP and MySQL support a lot of interesting native functions to do conversion from unsigned long integers back into dotted quad format. And I still have the spinning pinwheel, so I'm hoping I'm not sunk here. I'm going to have to kill this guy. Almost done. Can you open it? I don't know. Yes. Okay, so model behavior, IPv4 behavior. So this behavior made it real easy that every time I before save, I've got a callback here that changes the IP address back into a long integer, and every time I read it, I convert the unsigned long integer back into an IP address. So I thought this was a pretty interesting, handy way to do this. And so every time I go in and do IP address management here, which is, if you've ever done IP address design or any of that stuff, you know that there's a ton of binary math, right? Every time I create an IP address, a subnet, I got to figure out, like, okay, what's my next available address? Is that out of scope? Is that in a different scope? Because I can slice and dice a IPv4 network in a whole bunch of different ways. So, for example, I could add an IP address here, and I'll call it subnet 4, and it is a /29, which means I think I should get 9 valid IP addresses. I don't know if this one actually has space, so I can cruise down here. Where is my, oh, there it is, subnet 4. Okay, so now I want to add a server there. I can call this server 1. It needs an IP address. It's a host address. I don't have any gateways yet on this network. And here I've got 10.0.0.1. That's my first valid IP address in that space. So through a combination of this tree behavior, which manages this awesomely, and my little behavior to do the IP address encoding and decoding here, I've hopefully made my life a little bit easier, because this stuff gets mind-bogglingly complex when you've got large, complicated networks split into a whole bunch of different ways. One or two other features that I'll just sort of mention real fast. Like I said, we use Google Earth extensively to look at a network or look at a large geography before we deploy a team halfway around the world to go install it. So KML import, reading and writing Google Earth KML files is something that we've gone ahead and implemented, as well as generating equipment lists as PDFs, which I can then print out and I can send or give to somebody and say, okay, you need to go to the warehouse, you need to pick one board, 2-inch pipe grabs, all this other stuff, which you're gonna need when you get out there. So they go to the warehouse, they fill a box with this stuff, they jump in their truck and off they go. Likewise, we have what we call work orders, which thanks to the Excel, XML, don't open the Xcode. Which then at least we can open up in a, something like Excel or OpenOffice or whatever. Which similar things I can say, okay, here's all the coordinates, here's all the information that you guys need to go put together the site. So Cake's been really, really useful for us for getting a grip on designing and deploying and managing these networks. Like I said, we're a long ways away from the 6 to 7 week schools database that this thing started out as. But along the way, we've come up with some pretty cool things, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are. Yes.
So you mentioned you work out in remote locations in like Africa and that. How do you deal with things like theft and pirates?
Well, most of these locations here, and I don't know if I happen to have a good one in front of me. Most of these towers are surrounded by concrete walls that have barbed wire at the top of them. And generally, there is always a guardian, in this case, Joyce. I would call Joyce at this phone number when I need access, and Joyce lives nearby or gets paid by whoever owns the tower to take care of it. So really, there's none that I can actually think of off the top of my head, cases where we have equipment that's just out in the open. It's always in a protected place. And then our equipment is usually in a locked box. We have weatherproof enclosures that have a padlock that are installed within the walls of the tower. Yes?
I was curious to know, what version of Cake did you start developing in? If it's different than what it's in now? And what kind of troubles did you have going from one version to another that was in Cake?
So, question is, how have the Cake versions evolved? And, I started with 2 dot something, and I'll say 2 dot, I don't know if the exact release number, but in the low 2s. And we're currently on 2.3.5. And I would say that by and large, I've had pretty much no issues in terms of upgrading the versions. I think initially I was personally confused on the upgrade process. I thought that was a little ambiguous as to which files can I just overwrite and how should I do that in case I bork something up and need to go back. But fortunately, the upgrade process, kind of staying every sort of point release behind has been really pretty painless. So I'm grateful for that. And go ahead. That's a great question here. So I'm on the live site right now. I'm going to switch back to my local host. One of the features that we built really as a proof of concept, because we don't have funding to do it completely. We use a network monitoring system called OpenNMS. We're kind of in the process of switching to another one called Zabbix. Both of those have nice APIs that we can call out to and say, hey, what's the status of this router? And one of the features that I didn't show here, and I'll just real briefly talk to it, is that from my application here, I can what's called provision a radio, which is push a radio out into my network monitoring system. So I've configured it just as I want it with the SSID at this frequency, all the other little settings, that kind of stuff. And now I can say, okay, go out to the network monitoring system, because this application is not a network monitoring system, and I don't really ever want to build a network monitoring system because it's super hard. So I push a radio, I provision it out into OpenNMS, and there is a process out there that periodically goes out and says, hey, OpenNMS, tell me what's going on with ALX-INV, although it actually queries on something here that's called the foreign ID, which is how OpenNMS likes to do it. So I have a job that runs, that pulls all that information back, and I was hoping to demo that today, but I borked up a VMware upgrade, and that machine is offline, and I'm struggling to get it back. But that pulls back the information on what's going on in the network here, and so our simplified view here is to say, okay, I have a site has many things at it. If everything in the site is good, the site is green. If everything in the site is down, the site is red, and if one thing, or if there's some combination thereof, the site is yellow, which means someone probably needs to figure that out. And so now here, at least I have a little bit more easier to see view of my network. I can see, okay, this site's green, that site's yellow, that site's red, because tools like OpenNMS are super complicated. And when you're working with teams that are not trained network engineers, we work with a lot of entrepreneurs and other folks who are interested in IT, but that's sometimes a jump to being full-on network administrator, network guru, being able to troubleshoot a network here. At least I have sort of more of a green light, yellow light, red light dashboard view into the network. Super. Well, thank you so much, and for the first speaker on the last day, I hope I did all right. Thanks.